Gotcha. Wire on the left. All right. So we wrapped up last time saying we were going to talk about children, and we're not going to talk about children. We will talk about that another time. But
we're fickle.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to we had discussed what that should look like, talking about having kids, and I wanted to have our wives in if we could, because they've been so instrumental. I think even saying instrumental, they are the core of our children and their upbringing. Sure. Yeah. So this week we decided to talk instead about civic responsibility, what it means to be, and it's really interesting. The word civics. Recently, I was talking to someone about just the education system, public education system. And how we do it. We do it with a classical education system, with a cooperative with our kids, and the idea of civics, of just learning what it means. Oh, I know what it was. My daughter had an essay she had to write, and the essay was what it means to be a good citizen. What does it mean to be a good citizen? Sorry, I'm just realizing that this is not doing what I wanted to do. So we're going to leave it there for a second. Sorry, the cuts. And I thought, how often do we think about that? How often do we educate around that? Do we teach our students what it means to be a good citizen? And then how does that then coincide with or dovetail with what it means to be a good Christian, right? And so as we have an election coming up in a couple of weeks, we thought it might be a good time to stop and talk about civic responsibility, civic engagement. Do we have a responsibility to engage? Should we engage? How should we engage? How should we not engage? Not how we should vote. That's not really, a lot of people want to know, how are you going to vote? How are you going to vote? And I'm glad to tell them what leads me to a decision. Yeah. I don't know any thoughts.
Did you have civics class in high school?
Yeah. 11th grade we did government.
Okay.
So that was civics. It was learning, the branches of government, the responsibilities of each branch, how that process works of bringing a bill to the legislature, getting it passed, how the population engages and elects and those kinds of things. Is that is that what you had?
Yeah, we had.
I was in public school.
I was in public school as well, but we had ours was 9th grade, and it was a full civics class, a whole year of studying government and how you could be engaged in government, how government worked. I don't know I'm trying to think how in the world you could spend an entire year, but it was an entire year's curriculum just on civics in our 9th grade year, which I found was really good. My parents were always kind of engaged politically, not necessarily like what we see today in terms of protesting or whatever, but were kind of strong on their opinions, always voted in every election. So that's kind of how I grew up, and so
my dad always had opinions, and so and so I always heard them. My mom not as much, and I'm sure my kids would probably say the same thing. And so I always knew what he thought about politics in particular. That class was really enlightening to me in 11th grade, and I don't know if they still do it. I'd be interested to. I don't think they do, which is a shame because it taught me all the ins and outs, and I remembered all of them because I had a kind of a keen interest in politics. And so even that, okay, so talking about an interest in politics, and I think one of the things that I've heard people say is, oh, no, as believers, we shouldn't be, and the phraseology changed, but we shouldn't be involved in politics, or we should be involved in politics. And I'd say there's obviously some caveats or definitely some ways in which we should engage in politics and ways in which we shouldn't engage as believers. And what I said to you was that people want to say, oh, well, God is sovereign and he'll do whatever he wants. I agree that God is sovereign. Total agreement there. Is he going to do is he going to do his will? Total agreement. Yes, he is. But he put us here for something. We're supposed to be involved and participate, right? And so if you take that to one end of the spectrum, that I'm supposed to let God be sovereign, you can be a slug in your bed, not getting up in the morning because God's going to do what he wants to do, you know? So that's not the answer. It's not the answer to do nothing, right? And so the other side, at the end of that spectrum, I would say, is probably the person that thinks if the person that they don't want to be elected is not elected this cycle, that the world is going to fall apart, right? So I think both of those are wrong. And so what do you think about how we think about engaging?
Yeah, I just kind of to pick up on the term of God's sovereignty, we immediately try to narrow that down to me. God is directing me personally in every step that I make. And I think in a sense that's true, but it doesn't absolve us of human responsibility. I mean, Paul takes time to articulate that in Romans, but also in Romans when Paul is talking about nationalistic Israel, which is where a lot of the sovereignty of God talk comes in. He's talking about a nation of people, a group of people that God is sovereignly moving together in a direction in order to say, hey, God's not done with Israel, though he's grafting in the Gentiles. He's not done with Israel. There is a plan and a purpose that's going to come about. And I think that is kind of the greater way in which God, or the scriptures talk about God's sovereignty, is in a nationalistic, a broader type of way. And unfortunately, when we want to narrow that down so much, it can absolve us of all responsibility. Like you said, well, God is sovereign, so, he's going to provide my food. I don't have to do anything to earn it. I don't have to do anything to strive for holiness. I don't need to do anything evangelistically, which is, consistently the criticism, particularly of those who would kind of really embrace that Reformed Calvinist label. And again, I love those brothers. I just don't always like the labels. Yeah. I think they bring a lot of positive things to the table, particularly in a high view of the Word of God, which I really respect and embrace. But there's also this notion of human responsibility. And again, I don't fully grasp the mystery of how human responsibility and God's sovereignty interact with one another. But there is human responsibility, and James is very clear in that and his articulation. I don't think he's in any way opposed to Paul's writings, but James takes it a step further and says, hey, you can have faith, you can believe in all these things, but if you're not doing anything, your faith's not doing anything.
Do something. Right.
So when we think about civic engagement, I wonder how much of particularly our American culture has come into the church of what has been really posited as almost a core tenet of American political thought, the separation of church and state, which is, again, I know, I'm sure most people know, it's not in the Constitution. It is not something that has ever been embraced or codified in law.
The concept that's constitutional is that the church, that the state shall not establish a religion.
Right. It was not to prevent us from speaking of our religious beliefs in the government realm. It was to prevent the government from forcing, a religious belief upon the people. But at any rate.
Yeah. So where we go from there is, and people would say, well, politics is dirty and DC is dirty and it's corrupt. This idea of corruption and the church shouldn't have any part of it because of the corruption. That doesn't hold water in any other part of society, that the church shouldn't involve because it's corrupt. I mean, what about the church's engagement in we both know a man who is very active in the red light district of Bombay, India, right? And so he is going into the corrupt places and trying to bring light and hope to people who are in darkness.
Yeah.
And so I think that is obviously a mandate of believers, is to bring light and hope into darkness and dark places. So, if DC if we believe the hyperbole that DC is corrupt and dark and dirty and the swamp, and I agree, there's a lot of it there. Yeah. I do agree. And the reason why there's a lot of it there is, my estimation, is because of all the money. There's so much money there being thrown around, the taxpayers' money being thrown around that breeds corruption. Yeah. It does. It brings corrupt people there. It corrupts good morals, and I think that's a biblical concept. And so then how do we then reconcile that with our this mandate to be, as Paul says in Romans, subject to the governing authorities? Because that's one of the things that people like to throw at me when I talk about my disagreements with the way our current government acts, and what I would say oppresses, and so they say, well, people in the church would say we need to be subject to the governing authorities. And so, what do you think about that? Before we get into voting and elections and things like that, what do you think about Romans 13 in light of someone who is, and you said something about American culture comes into our church. Of course, we're Americans, yeah. And so we're Americans walking into the church with all the education and upbringing and presuppositions of Americans, and we walk into the church, and then our Americanism definitely is part of us. But how do we keep that from? And then how are we obedient to Romans 13, or how would you take Romans 13 and apply that and make sure that we're processing that correctly as American Christians?
Yeah, I think we have to recognize our first citizenship is in heaven.
Correct.
Yeah. When we are believers in the Lord Jesus Christ, our citizenship immediately changes. I had the opportunity on July 4th to go to a naturalization ceremony up at Monticello, and that was the first one that I'd ever had the opportunity to go to, which was really interesting in a lot of ways. One, because it was like 70 some people that were naturalized, and they allowed them to just open share. It was probably, I don't know.
That's pretty cool.
It was like at least 500 people there, if not more. And then you had, the 70 or so that were being naturalized, and it was just open. As many of them as wanted to share could, and they left it. They just kind of waited for whoever. And what was
just an open mic.
Open mic.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
And it wasn't like, hurry up. I mean, it was just, we're giving you your opportunity. And even the judge who was presiding over it, he said, this is one of my favorite parts.
That's really neat.
And it actually makes you a little, for me, I was sitting there, it made me a little emotional, of what I take for granted as an American citizen. But it was interesting to see how they were embracing this newfound citizenship, particularly the ones who came from more oppressive governments. They were, but not just them. I mean, it was others as well who just saw the opportunity that they were given. And I think we ought to have a similar feeling in terms of our transference of citizenship from this world to our heavenly citizenship. And that becomes our first and primary citizenship, is our citizenship in heaven. And so that does, to me, that tempers our zeal in some ways for trying to force change into this present world, because we do recognize God's gracious hand is at work. I guess that's really what should separate us from quote unquote the world versus Christians, is we realize we do want to fight for the principles of heavenly citizenship, but we also realize that this is not all there is. Whereas people, when you look at people who are fighting from a worldly perspective, this is it. They, this is why it gets militant at times, and why people burn cities at times and businesses and other things, because they don't feel like their voice is being heard.
Yeah.
Well, when we realize,
Right. This is their only hope.
yeah,
Yeah, and that's one of the. I'm sorry.
no,
Yeah.
go ahead.
I would say that's one of the things that I think is important to be kind of a ground level, foundational understanding that our hope is not in politics, right? That said, good can come out of it, and we can like I said before, bring light into a dark place. Politics is not the end all. It's not that's not the hope for the world, and that's not the hope for our country. But it is a way to one of the things is to restrain evil, to make sure that evil doesn't have a breeding ground and doesn't have a foothold or get a foothold. Morality is something that is kind of that conscience within us, the Spirit of God within us kind of says, okay, that's not right. That's not right. And so I think morality is something that we do need to make sure is established and enforced, and that's something that we always hold to in our political systems, right? In our laws. And so that's something, but it's not the hope. It's not the end all. It's not the hope for us. But there's it's like juggling. I'm sitting here juggling back and forth. It's not the hope, but it's definitely something, and we need to really make sure that we engage. Okay, so then how do we engage? What does that look like for a believer?
Well, you think about Jesus during his time on the earth, and you say, well, Jesus wasn't political. He wasn't engaging with the Romans, but he was engaging with the Pharisees, and that was the political system of Israel at the time, and he was consistently, pointing out their corruption, and what made him most upset was they're taking advantage of other people, and
right.
That has traditionally been where Christians have been on the front line of government reform and other things.
Correct.
When we see those who cannot speak for themselves, or those who cannot defend themselves, Christians, again, I believe by the Spirit of God, by the grace of God, the church has been at the forefront of trying to reform the practices of government, or pray against, prayer, whether it's being active in various areas to try to reform. You see it, with regards to slavery. You see it with regards to abortion. You see it, you look at Harriet Tubman on the Underground Railroad. Most of the waypoints that she would stay were Christian believers who were acting out of faith that this was unjust.
The abolition movement in both the UK and here were led by Christians. Correct.
And you see the same with the move against abortion today and modern human trafficking and other things. It is generally people of a Christian persuasion. So why is it? Why do Christians, why do Christians advocate for life and not taking advantage of the defenseless or those who can't help themselves in some way? It's because we believe in what theologians call the imago Dei, or the image of God, is resident in every single person.
Every person,
from
correct.
conception to death. This is what motivates the Christian to defend life, because from the moment of conception to the moment of natural death, the image of God is resident in humans. This is why, we don't, animals are different, whereas the world at times seems to want to protect animals more than it does human life. We clearly see that. But for a Christian, it's because people are image bearers of God that we press and we push, even in the political sphere, to make a difference, because we want God's image to be honored and respected and glorified.
And I would say that's one of those things that people might accuse it of being a pet issue, or one of these issues that's a hot button topic. But I think that really is one of those issues that believers should consider when you think about voting. Is when I vote for and that's one of the things I got to tell you, civic engagement. We're going to kind of get back to the roots here. One of the things we don't do enough of, we only consider the national elections, and we do not consider our board of supervisors, our school board, our state legislature, and that's really an oversight that's to our own shame, because the people that affect my life the most day to day are going to be my local legislators and board members, governors, things like that. So we need to not neglect those. That said, those big hot button topics, abortion in particular, is one of those things that it is kind of a litmus test. It is one of those things we should say, okay, is it important? Is it critical? Is it vital? Is it kind of a preeminent issue? Are we going to defend life? And I think it is.
For me, that's the primary issue. What person, what issue does the most to advance the cause of respecting human life, because humans bear the image of God. So, you can think about, foreign policy, you can think about domestic policy, and all the other kind of issues. But ultimately, it has to come down to what is one's perception of the issue of life. And so you say, oh, you're a single issue voter, and that's not a good thing. But, for me as a Christian, being in the world but not of the world, thinking about life in all of its forms, human life and all of its forms, whether it's the unborn, whether it's those who have diminished maybe mental capacity, whether it's aged who are defenseless, the way that we treat those who are most vulnerable in our culture and society determines, I think, how God eventually will bring judgment upon us.
So an aside here, but so when I was young, I think I knew and was aware of quite a few people with Down syndrome. I saw they would be in our classes when we were young in school, public school. I had friends and people at. I'm trying to remember if I had someone that I knew with Down syndrome at church, but they were around us, and some of the sweetest and most kind and gentle people you ever met in your life. And they're disappearing. Mm-hmm. And you think, okay, people think that there's some people would say that it's a genetic flaw that should be eliminated, and it has been systematically through the course of the last couple decades. Is many people who get a Down syndrome diagnosis in utero abort their pregnancy, their baby. And you think that's one of the consequences of not just they say the engineers and the people that could have been, vaccines and all the things that could have happened if abortion had not been something that has become commonplace in the U.S. I just think even the Down syndrome people that have been aborted just because it's a genetic flaw. It's just one of those. It's one of those things that you notice and you think, oh, that is a direct result of us not restraining evil. One of the things that you said, you were saying that the primary issue or a one issue, if you're a one issue voter, that is a common accusation. I'm a one issue voter. Mm-hmm. I would like to think that if in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, whenever, that if the issue were slavery and we were voting about, and people were saying, we really need to abolish slavery, that I would be on the right side of that and say, yep, that's the main issue. Yeah. That's an issue that I can absolutely, and if you have one candidate that says, no, slavery's great, and it's a necessary part of our society, we really have to protect it. We have to protect it, Yeah. That I would be on the other side and say, no, it's a horrid miscarriage of justice and treating people like they're not people, and I would like to think that I would be on the right side of that, and so I don't apologize for, like you said, kind of holding that up as a very primary issue.
Yeah, well, I think you make a good point about our culture who is willing to abort the less fortunate, mm-hmm. or marginalize the less fortunate, when that's exactly opposite of what the gospel calls us to.
Correct.
The gospel calls us to look after and to pursue widows and orphans, those in distress, those who are in difficult places. What did Jesus do? You look at the miracles were those who were the outcasts, the leprous.
Yeah.
You look at when it's condemnation of the Pharisees at times, when they bring the adulterous woman, before, and Jesus shows compassion. Those who had been the marginalized in society, and Jesus brings them into the kingdom. And there's the parables of the ruler who says, I'm doing I'm having a party, and I'm inviting all of the nobles and all of the high up people, and they all say, "Oh, I've got this, and I've got that, and I've got to do this and the other." And he says, "Go out and compel all those who are in the highways and in the byways and the downcast and the downtrodden, compel them to come in." And you think that's that's what the Lord did for us.
Yeah,
we were those people. And I think sometimes we forget in our self-righteousness that such were some of you. And we have an obligation, not just in the church and in terms of like a ministry of the local church, but we have an obligation as a people to stand forward, to be a watchman on the wall. It's kind of like proclaiming this is injustice. And that's actually, that's what the prophets did in the Old Testament.
Yep.
Hey, you're not watching after those who are in distress. You're not looking after the poor, and God's bringing his judgment. Now, again, I think we have to be careful in that we say, oh, then let's get all these government programs to help.
Yeah, agreed.
I don't think that's the responsibility of government.
Yeah, I agree.
It's the responsibility of Christians in the church to step forward. And again, look at 100 years ago, where were most of the orphanages? Most of the orphanages were Christian-run orphanages. Do we see those anymore? We don't, because the government has taken that away.
Social services.
And so we said, okay, we'll outsource that to the government. And sure, there might have been certain challenges or other things, but the church was at the forefront of some of these early reforms, and now we've stepped back and we just kind of maybe throw money at it, which
to our own shame. The two commandments that Jesus gave us, I think, should always, as we. It's interesting. I was hearing some criticism of a Matt Chandler. There was something went viral recently. There was a Matt Chandler sermon series. He's doing some sermon series about civic engagement, really. And I think in this really tense time, we can sometimes forget what our mandates are, and as believers, they are to love the Lord our God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love our neighbor as ourselves. And so I think the one thing is, when we talk about engaging, how we should engage, how should we talk about the election, how should we talk about our politicians, how should we talk about people in general, how do we talk? How should we communicate with each other? And so I think we need to make sure that we are loving our neighbor as ourselves, right? Being true to the grace that Jesus gave us, and how we extend grace to others. But loving our neighbor is a mandate. It is a commandment. And so I think that is one thing that should color every part of our conversation when we talk about politics. Back to Romans 13. I'm sorry, I'm all over the place here. But back to Romans 13. One of the things that I've highlighted recently with people is that the being subject to the governing authorities that God has placed over us, one of the things that it follows in Romans 13, if you read it, is it says, and then so the ruler, if you do right, will reward you. But if you do wrong, they've been given a sword for a reason. And so it's interesting there, because people say, well, governing authorities sometimes are wicked. Okay, well, I would say to you that that's not the governing authority it's talking about, because it says if you do right, they're going to reward you. But if you do wrong, and that's God's right and God's wrong. And so I would say sometimes we need to read past the one little phrase to get the full context. And I would also say, that as a United States citizen, one of the things that we don't consider, and I've asked people this directly, what is the governing authority in our land? It's not the President of the United States. It's not Congress. It's not the Supreme Court. It's not the citizen. We are all subject to the Constitution of the United States. That is the governing authority that God placed over this country, right? Now, God is our authority, right, over the Constitution. But when it says, be subject to the governing authorities, okay, so I'm not putting words in your mouth. This is me talking, because I get into First Amendment and Second Amendment conversations all the time, as you can imagine, because I sell guns. And so I say, listen, I'm subject to the governing authorities. Romans 13, I take it, it's fine. I take it at face value. The governing authority in this land that the president is subject to, that Congress is subject to, they pretend like they're not, that the Supreme Court, they're all subject to the same one as I am, which is the Constitution of the United States. So when the Constitution says these are the powers that the legislature has, these are the powers that the president has, and these are and by the way, the Constitution says, I'm sorry, I'm getting off into a little bit of a rabbit trail here, but this is something that I'm not a Christian nationalist. That's one of those loaded terms, but I have to say, so when there's something that's unconstitutional, that I see something happening in the legislature or in the presidency or in the Supreme Court that's unconstitutional, my opinion, Romans 13 does not hold me to those things and say that you have to do these things if they're unconstitutional, because as an American citizen, the Constitution is the governing authority. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. You don't have to comment on it, but it's one of the things that I think that is the result of bad education, is people don't realize where the president gets his power and authority. He gets his authority from the Constitution that was ratified by the citizens of this country who give him the authority to rule over us, to execute law. He's the executive branch. Yeah. We give the authority to the legislature by the power of the Constitution. But it's really interesting too. There's unalienable rights given to us by God. And this is another misunderstanding, unfortunately, and I don't mean to monologue, and I apologize, but another misunderstanding that people have is that these rights that we have are never, ever, ever given to us by government. Government does not give us rights. God gave them to us. And so God gives us the rights that then government is supposed to protect.
And the founding fathers recognized that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. So how do we take that and put it back into this weave of conversation we're having about the responsibility of it? I think we do need to keep those things in mind as we then realize that the authority that gave us that authority is God. Mm-hmm. And so, and back to what I was going to say. Oh yeah. So the two commandments. The one thing I think we need to keep in mind too is that we need to keep unity and peace in the body of believers. That is one of the things that's absolutely commanded, and it's a given throughout Scripture. We just talked about it in the Young Adult Bible Study recently, is unity, 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 unity. Unity is not only it's not only a command, it's the character of the church. The church is characterized by unity. Yeah. So if there's not unity, then something is awry and it's not right. It's absolutely not right. So how do we then prioritize unity? Yeah,
so I think I want to speak to it in two ways, and I don't want to forget the second way when I start the first way. The first thing, I think I just look at the church right now that the Lord has allowed me to be a pastor of. We have people from multiple backgrounds, multiple nationalities who vote in different ways. We've got Republicans, staunch, Democrat, staunch, independents, people who don't vote, and otherwise. And so if I, as a pastor, get up and press towards a particular candidate or something along those lines, I have to be very cautious, number one, because I don't control that person's moral life. And if I hold them up to be a standard, I think that's difficult for me as a pastor who's leading a people who are living in a natural world, but citizens of a spiritual world. Mm-hmm. But I do think it's my responsibility to provide principles to live life effectively in the world that God has placed us. So I'm not going to talk about you should vote for this particular candidate or that particular candidate, but I will talk about, for instance, issues such as life that I think should bring unity within the church,
Yeah.
that we're all pressing and advocating for that. And then the individual decision that that person makes when they, fill in the oval for whichever candidate they're voting for, or pull the lever, or whatever it is that you're doing, that's really between them and the Lord. And I do think it should be something that they should pray about. Like, we should pray about, God, who should I vote for? So often our voting is through either our history as a people, whether, okay, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat, so I'm just going to vote party line, versus do we go in there and we ask God, God, what's your plan?
Yeah.
Who should I vote for here? And recognizing that his grace is at work even in that moment, I think we should participate. Like, Christians should be active.
Yeah, that's
in
what I was
the
going to say.
process.
So would you go as far as to say Christians should vote?
I think because we, by our government, have been given the opportunity to vote, that is a grace of God. We should vote. We should exercise the authority that God has given us. Many people don't have that authority. Many people don't have that opportunity. God has given us the opportunity to have a say. And you can say, oh, it's corrupt, it's this, it's that, and the other. I can't control all those variables.
Yeah.
But what I can control is that I walk in the voting booth and I do my duty and I walk away and I've done what I can. God has to control the rest. So I think in that, Christians should be compelled to participate based upon what the Lord is speaking to us. So in the sense of that, I think there should be unity. It should be unity in participation, should be unity as a people of God, should be unity that we're citizens in heaven. The other way, though, that people use that term unity is unity across the political spectrum. Like, we want to be in unity, so we're going to, at least in my role, when I hear the word unity at times, it means, we're going to welcome in people who are in same-sex relationships. We're going to affirm them because, they're in love with one another. We're going to welcome in people who have, other genders or other things like that. Again, that's not unity.
Mm-hmm.
The social justice warriors that masquerade in the church call for unity in that way, but we have to be careful of what the scriptures, when the scripture calls us to unity, it is of those who are part of the true church. And how do we know those who are part of the true church? We know by the things that they embrace that are biblical values. And so again, biblical values are those which are very clear from Scripture. God put man and woman together. We've talked about this previously. That's biblical. So we can't embrace and say, oh, we can be in unity with other people who say, I love Jesus, but yet are living a lifestyle opposed to Jesus, opposed to his mandate. We can't have unity there. But we can have unity in the true church. And Jesus said, the wheat and tares will grow together.
Mm-hmm.
So there's going to be some in the church who may not be of the church, but still may be part of a local body of believers in some way. But we can't have genuine, true unity there. So our unity has to be focused towards the biblical values that Scripture clearly articulates, that unites us as the church militant, those of us here on earth, and the church triumphant, those in heaven, that we're united together.
So what do we do about conversations that get, one of the things that is just a day-to-day thing, that we need to know how to handle conversations that get heated. And I guess one of the things that I say I do, that I would say that I do, that I need to maybe even be better at is the conversations that are important and the issues that are important and the things that are important. Keep the main thing, and don't get caught up in the silliness about, personalities, because both sides are right now, there's a lot of personality criticisms that are being thrown, and for good reason.
Yeah.
I mean, I watched the debate with my hands like this. What is happening? Like, and we talked about that a little bit, but the see truth, hear truth. We have very flawed people, very flawed people throwing personal attacks at each other, and so I think I don't want to be part of that. I don't. Yeah. I mean, I think I'm called not to be part of that, yeah. And so our conversation needs to be obviously not just civil, but we need to be concerned about each other. We need to be loving with each other, and so. What do you think about political conversations inside the church building? Do you think that's appropriate? Not ideal? Not appropriate? Not? Is it even possible to have those conversations tactfully in a way that that doesn't go off the rails? I feel like
question.
I'm setting you up there.
I think, in the culture in which we are right now, it's very difficult at times because one side characterizes the other essentially as Satan incarnate. Just depending on which side you're on. Oh, yeah. How many? So both sides are saying right now. Both of them are saying existential threat, existential threat. Yeah.
And it's like, wait.
But didn't they say that the last election?
Well, and you're thinking if it's true,
and the one before that.
Well, but if it's true that both sides can point to the other side and say they're an existential threat, we need to rebuild something.
Yeah.
If both sides are an existential threat, if that's the truth, then we've gone completely off the rails, and we need to do what the founders said. And we need to tear it down and rebuild it, because if that's true, But anyway,
so I think So let's mention the names that might bring some division. You think of Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. Mm-hmm. You've got some sides pointing to one or the other, saying again, that person's basically the Antichrist or Hitler or whatever, Sure. But we also have to realize as Christians, again, there's something more to these people than just their political viewpoints.
Yep.
So imagine if both of them, again, I'm not judging, so I'm not judging in the sense of just go by conversation and their talk, but I don't know that either one of them have had like a true, genuine, born-again Christian experience. I mean,
I'd be shocked if they said they had.
Yeah, I would be shocked, So to me, the greater thing that as the church, as believers, God, grab a hold of their heart. I mean, what would it be if both of them between now and November 4th came to a genuine saving knowledge of Jesus Christ?
Yeah.
I mean, what a transformation that would be. And so I think if we come in the church and we really, push the worldly side of politics, we're just going to create division between us and others, and I don't think that's good. I think to discuss the importance of the underlying principles of what motivates us to vote, or even more important, what motivates us to pray for these people, to have a prayer meeting for the salvation of our political leaders.
Yeah.
Like you said, I think just as well for those in our school board, for those in our county governments.
Yeah.
If we were to genuinely pray for God's gracious hand to transform their lives and then to get a taste of his glory and to live it out, how much better would that be? But when we spend so much time, pointing a finger and saying negative things, and I mean, does that really help? Does it help advance the cause of Christ? So that's maybe a principle that we have to think about when we talk about politics, particularly within the church, but also as a believer, talking about politics to someone who's not in the church.
Yeah. Well, I think about you think about how I always comment to people about what would Jesus do bracelets. Remember those? The what would Jesus do? And the WWJD, I always like the WDJD approach, and that's my own acronym, but what did he do? Because we don't necessarily know what he would do because he's not in our context. All we know is what he did do. Okay. And so what he did do is he was never harsh and critical, and he never beat down those who were the tax collector, the prostitute, the woman at the well, all the hated, marginalized people. He was never critical, and he said, "Go and sin no more." He was very direct.
Yeah.
But he was never he never beat them down, right? And so I think that's the one thing that if we find ourselves in conversations with people that is we're tearing down, that's not the way Jesus acted. No. So he never tore down. The only criticisms, and I read through Matthew 23 the other day, and Matthew 23 is the 7 woes. I think it's 7, it might be more. Woe to you, you hypocrites and liars, and the Pharisees and Sadducees. And it's pretty intense. If people think that Jesus was nice to everyone, they need to read Matthew 23 because he was not. So the criticism he held for the leaders, those who were leading other people astray. So anyway, I think we need to be really careful how we talk to each other, how we don't demonize each other. We have more in common than we have not in common, differences. And so what do we do, because we know it's coming, November 6th. So church would be 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th. Would it be the 9th, I guess, or 9th or 10th? Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. It's just the 10th. So November 10th, I think there's going to be a big part of the country on one side or the other that's going to be very upset and disappointed November 6th or 7th, whenever we get results. How do we come into the church and ensure that we always have unity in the body? What advice would you give, or what thoughts do you have about what to do after? Because I agree with you. I think we should all engage, and we should vote. We should prayerfully vote. But what do we do after to remain united? At least in the church. The church is commanded to be united. We know there's not going to be unity in other places, but the church is commanded to it.
Well, you think, what does Scripture clearly tell us? It tells us that God puts leaders in place. Yeah. So we may, again, we have to be careful of kind of a fatalistic mentality. God's going to put in who he's going to put in, so I don't have to vote. No, I don't. I think he holds us accountable for the opportunities that we have. I think we should vote, we should engage, but ultimately it's God who sets leaders up and God who takes leaders down. And so whichever way things fall out in all the elections that happen in our country, I think the Sunday after, the responsibility of the church is to pray for your leaders, pray for those who are over you. Thank the Lord that, he has given us an opportunity to not just participate with our vote, but to participate with our prayers. And do we neglect that opportunity? And I also think it's an opportunity for us to examine our heart. Do we have is there a block that would either cause us to not pray for that leader or to root for that leader's failure? Or do we turn then and say, okay, the decision is made. It's my responsibility now to pray that God would move in such a way that leader exemplifies the principles of the kingdom, whether it's in their primary nature or not. I think as a church, we have to come together, pray for our leaders, and do so very sincerely. Jesus Jesus condemned the Pharisees because they would say certain things and kind of wink, wink, nod, nod, not really meaning it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if the election turns out, say, in ways that maybe you or I would say, this is horrible, are we able to come together on Sunday and genuinely say, God, move upon this particular person
agreed.
and touch their life, give them wisdom from you, help them, to make righteous decisions, because the country benefits when our leaders make righteous decisions.
Yeah, yeah, agreed. And I think, to dismiss God's power to do whatever he wants to do or is going to do is also faithlessness. So for us to think, oh no, God looked away for a second and he just missed this, and oh no, November 5th, God wasn't paying attention, is obviously a fallacy. And so I think, there's certain ways that we get our minds into, I'd really like to see this happen.
Yeah.
But then I think that's personal. That's some self-restraint. It's self-discipline. It's also just acknowledging this, again, the sovereignty of God, that he's going to do what he wants to do. I should be engaged. I should participate. I should desire for things, for the marginalized to be protected. Those things, that certain things I should desire. And just for clarity, I think both of the major parties in our country have some real problems. So I just don't want people to think, oh, you're an R or a D, or you're blue or you're red. That is not my approach to it at all. There are some real problems in government. I think it's just a function of the fact that we're flawed and sinful, and I actually think we could talk about this some other time, but I think if you look back at Babel, what happened? God told them to disseminate, to disperse, right? It was the second time he told them to do this. The first time was in the garden. He said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, have dominion over it. The second time was after Noah and his family come off the ark, and he says, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and have dominion over it. And they spread out, and then they all come together in this valley, and they say, wow. And they all come together. And so I think what happens when humanity brings all of our humanity together, a lot of times we really get full of ourselves. And I think that's what's happened switching. That's what's happened in places like DC and our cities, is that we get all this pooled arrogance together. And so that's both parties. That is the R's and the D's and the blues and the reds. We really have some pooled arrogance that we need to pray through, I think.
You just think about it. When Jesus came on the scene, you had the law that was given to Moses by God, and then throughout the years, there's these other laws that gets layered on top, layer after layer after layer after layer. And then Jesus comes on the scene and he says, I'm boiling it down to two, basically.
Yeah.
And you think about our form of government, 250 years ago, there was a foundation laid, and now we have career politicians who layer after layer after layer after layer of laws. And so there is a need at times for reform movements, to kind of put the power back in its rightful place, or at least to put the focus back on the things that it should be focused on. But there is this consistent need, I guess, within the human heart, that we want to control our destiny. Your comment about Babel, we're going to control our destiny. We're the ones who are going to reach up to the heavens. I think that's still in the human heart.
And make a name for ourselves is what they said. Make a name for ourselves. And I think that is the spirit of DC, unfortunately.
Yeah. We
are going to build something and make a name for ourselves. And that is flawed no matter what the letter is behind it.
I would say, to think about this discussion in the context of the church, we have to be careful, even as a local church, to say, we're going to make a name for ourselves. That's not our responsibility. Our responsibility is to make a name for the Lord, to exalt his name. And we always have to be cautious because, again, I go back to, I think it was Calvin. It may have been one of the other early reformers, but they talked about the human heart is an idol factory. And
it's an interesting
concept. And so you think about that in our context. We're constantly thinking of ways to puff ourselves up.
Yeah.
So we have to be careful of that.
So I'm trying to think of concluding ways to kind of put a bow on it, as it were. Well, I know I'm voting.
Yeah, me too.
I know I'll be watching. I think I would say this is not just for the church, but just for the concerned citizen. The concerned citizen and the believer should both be hoping and praying for a peaceful result, for things to be clear, and for people to be at peace. And however that happens, I'm not sure, but yeah, I think that's my prayer. My prayer is for, and I'll tell you what I'd like to see happen. And because I don't mind sharing. I don't have to pastor a church. I just have to run a business. So I have a little bit more liberty, which I really hope that it goes one way or the other. Very, very. It's very clear. Like I would rather, if I have one way or the other, and there is a way that I'd like to see it go, but if it goes the other way, I hope it goes the other way, like just so definitively that people are just silenced. Yeah. I really, the whole waiting for days and days, and then everyone getting uptight, and the angst that it creates in our is not healthy. It's not good. It's not. So I hope we can do it without that angst. I really do.
And I would say, as Christians, as believers, we have to realize we're in a much different place than the people of the world. We have an eternal hope.
Yes.
They only have this temporal hope.
Agreed.
So they are going to see things differently.
That's a great way to conclude it. Yeah.
They're going to see things differently.
Yeah.
Than we should see things, no matter which way it goes. Our hope is not here. It's in heaven.
So we need to remind each other of that too.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of people in the church that are going to be, woe is me, and we just need to say, whoa.
But also extend grace to those who don't know the Lord and aren't in relationship to Him, and realize this is their only hope.
Yeah.
This election,
goodness. Can
I
you
think
imagine?
it's important, but it's not the end all be all.
I was going to say, if you can you imagine thinking November 5th is my only hope?
Yeah.
That's a lot of distraught people on November 6th. And so, yeah.
Yeah, and I know we're trying to bring it to a close. There's so much here that we could, but I think, you think you and I have a unique, and a lot of Christians who maybe came up in our era have maybe a bit of a unique perspective because we were kind of raised in the church in a lot of ways. So for us to kind of think outside of that and think, well, how does someone who's never had that hope, who's never believed in Jesus, for me, it's actually hard to put myself in their shoes.
Yeah.
That there's just no sense that there's anything beyond this life, that the grave is it.
Yeah.
That's all.
It's a sad thought.
But there are people who genuinely feel that way. And so that's why they feel like I've got to be so passionate and this is so important and this is all there is. And, so to have compassion there for people who believe very differently than us but don't carry our hope, I think is important.
Agreed. Couldn't wrap it up any better. Next time, hopefully we'll have our wives here. We'll talk about having kids and raising kids. And until then,
good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.